Hello everyone, welcome to Limbo. My name is João, and today I'm joined by Nikhil Gupta, founder of Determinant Materials, a company building what he calls the last American metal refinery, aiming to become the national champion for critical metals. In this conversation, we unpacked how China came to dominate this space and why that creates a strategic vulnerability for the United States and the West, and what would it take to basically reverse course. We go deep in his story. We talked about where his ambition came from, the hero's journey mindset, and what are some of the differences between building a company in the world of atoms or building a company in the world of computer bits. Nikhil explains the old paradigms of metal refining and why so much of the world is stuck copying mining era processes, and how Determinant's microparticle approach could reshape recycling these materials and basically supply chains from the ground up. If you care about industry, geopolitics, clean tech realities, and what reindustrialization actually looks like in 2026, you'll want to hear this one. Now, before you go, quick word from our sponsors. The first one, of course, Contest, the nonprofit that allows for this podcast to exist, and also the place that gives birth to our podcast, to the name of our podcast, the restaurant Limbo in Lisbon. If you're there, just check them out. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Nikhil Gupta.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Limbo Podcast. Today I have with me Nikhil Gupta. Nikhil, thank you for coming to the show. How are you feeling? Everything okay?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Feeling good today.
Awesome. So I want to start by asking you a question. So when we met through Neil, I searched your Twitter, and you have one of the most badass bios on the whole Twitter/X platform. It says, and this is a quote: "You're building the last American metal refinery," and then you put an American flag afterwards. Tell me, what does this mean?
Yeah, sure. And I should clarify, and I appreciate. Thank you for that. Initially, at times, sometimes I use the phrase "the last American refinery." Sometimes I say "the last American metal refinery," because sometimes when I was talking to people, they think of refinery as only oil and gas industry, oil refining. But we're doing metal refining. So what that means is, when I say we're the last American metal refinery, it means that we are basically building the sort of end all be all. We are building the metal refinery for America, right? We're becoming that national metal refining champion. And we're going to completely dominate that space. We're going to become the national champion for this. We're going to be like the Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel of old, but for high tech metal refining today. So, basically we're going to be the new paradigm, and it's going to be the last type of refinery out there, what we're doing.
I love it. So one of the things that I immediately write down after the first time that we called was, like, you are a clearly very ambitious individual. Walk me through, like, your origin story. Like, were you always like that ambitious? Was that something that you developed? Like, walk me through that.
Yeah, well, that's funny. Sometimes ambition can be it almost feels delusionally so at times. So, I mean, you'd have to ask my parents or my siblings how they think it began. I think to some extent, I think it's always been there. I think you tend to have, like, a chip on your shoulder. I think a lot of founders are like this. Chip on their shoulder, like you feel like you're different. You almost like don't fit in or don't belong. And then I think for me, like, it's like I've always been into good stories, which is funny because, like, now I'm learning how to tell stories. It's kind of something you have to really do as a founder. But I've always been into books. I used to read like crazy. I used to watch like lots of movies and stuff like that. So I would start to sort of like almost like think, oh, if I was this character, if I was that character, you sort of start to emulate them, frankly. So I think you just kind of like see what the world has done, what historical figures have done, what fictional characters have done, what your peers have done out there. And that's kind of how this sort of ambition gets formed. You're like, well, look, if they can do it, then I can do it too. Like Jobs has that quote, Steve Jobs has that quote. It's like, everything you see around you, I mean, I'm probably not getting it right fully, but everything you see around you was created by someone, right? It's like essentially what he's getting at in that, I think it's in the Stanford speech, commencement speech. He's basically saying that, like, look, it all seems magical what society has built, what other humans have built, which you're a human being too. You have that within you. So, when times are tough, I kind of dig down and try to find that sort of resilience to work on these big things. And that's kind of that's where kind of a lot of these long-term ambitions are. Like, oh well, this, you could have this ceiling, but what if you went this far? What if you went farther and farther?
Yeah.
That's kind of how sort of my mindset is on things.
Yeah, it's beautiful. What were some of the historical figures that were inspiring you when you were younger, or just movie characters, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I already gave homage to the industrialists, right? So the Industrial Revolution, like obviously the Carnegie, the Rockefeller. There are obviously a lot of others out there. Fictional stories, like, yeah, just, I don't know, different like movies or different books I've read over time. It's like you just see, and even if they're not doing anything at all related to what you're doing, it's almost like, well, you see the adversity of the character undergoes, right? And it's like, if they can get through it in some way, it's like, I don't have this crazy kind of situation, even though it's fiction. You feel like you can kind of surmount these problems as well.
Yeah, it's like this meta story of resilience and like struggling and getting over those things, and you kind of feel inspired by it.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like I don't think we should go down this tangent, but it's almost like the kind of 3-act play, the 3-act story, or it's like the hero's journey. I think the hero's journey actually has had a lot of influence on me, right? So it, often like you're especially with the 3 acts, you're going through that adversity, and there's always that tough moment, and it's like, how do you recruit allies? What's your origin story? Or even playing video games. I didn't mention that. Like growing up playing video games. Okay, I'll mention one there, like Legend of Zelda, like Ocarina of Time.
Ocarina of Time. Okay.
Is the best video game that's ever been made, hands down. I'll die on that hill. But it's like you start out like sucking at like you have no abilities, nothing, like you have no relationships and network. And then the founder's journey, the hero's journey, the startup journey is you kind of recruit allies, you build up your skill sets, you get things done, and you eventually you get beat down by the boss in many instances, which in this case is like lots of setbacks that you have as doing a startup. But eventually you build that sort of mass, and you kind of build that critical mass and skill set and kind of network that you can eventually overcome the adversity. Eventually you beat the bosses out, so you succeed as a startup, right? In the long term.
So okay, so let's dive into like the particular journey that you had, and how is it that you end up working on Determining Materials, your company? It's a very specific thing, and we talked about before this, where you walked me through a little bit of how at a given point you were part of the whole climate tech and seeing like some of the issues, but for people who don't know your story, like, how is it that you end up working on Determining Materials?
Yeah, so I mean, the background is, I'm a kid from suburban Connecticut. Family's from the city, New York City, but I grew up in suburban Connecticut, Fairfield County. I went to school outside of Boston. There's a much longer story, I guess, as part of this, but basically, I went to school outside of Boston. It was sort of it was basically right after the financial crisis, right? So, I graduate, global financial crisis, GFC happens in 2008. I graduate 2009. I go to school. I go to college, whatever, I guess in September or something. I go to school in the Boston area. So I think there's always been that sort of geopolitics, supply security, resource emphasis in my sort of DNA from a young age, the imprinting, I guess you could say. And again, there's a lot of other threads we could touch on there, but basically, 2008 was obviously a housing thing, but it was very much also an energy shock. The price of oil has actually never, in inflation adjusted terms, and maybe even in nominal terms, it's never reached the price it reached. Like the crude oil reached $150 a barrel in 2008. So I think that actually played a huge impact in like causing partly the financial crisis. So you could see a lot of energy and resource insecurity. And that's how I got into that sort of space, like climate tech, clean tech, energy resource security, geopolitics, all that, because it's all tied up in this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so, I went to school outside of Boston. I went to this place called Olin College of Engineering, small engineering school, only engineering. I was there,
which was literally built to reinvent like how engineering is work, right? I did a little bit of research. You got a full scholarship, and part of what I was wondering is how much was, because from my understanding, the fact that you're just hanging out with a lot of engineers at such an early age, do you think that has like how has that shaped the way that you looked at the whole industry and the whole like craft of engineering, if in any way?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting experience. Like there may be some downsides not being near like as much people with other disciplines, like maybe liberal arts or traditional sciences or business, but it was like a firepower, frankly, for like the engineering connection, and like the engineering brain in more than one discipline, right? Like I did some study at another university just for a semester while I was at Olin, just to see what it was like there as well. And when you're like in one of these big engineering schools, it's basically like you're a chemical engineering student, right? Or you're electrical or mechanical, right? And that's all you interact with. You only interact with those people, right? So you only think like that. I mean, I'm sure later on you broaden out, but in the beginning, you're really only just a mechie or you're a chemie or an EE, right? Um, at Olin, because you're mixed with all the other engineers from day one and all your classes, a lot of shared classes and like interdisciplinary, you're learning to think how like an electrical engineer would work or how a mechanical engineer would work or vice versa. So like a lot of that really definitely helps you think interdisciplinary, and it does help, I think, a lot with startups, because startups are really much about like how do you solve a lot of like really hairy big problems that have a lot of interconnections. And so like having that interdisciplinary skill set and also being able to like deal with a lot of uncertainty and figure things out on the fly is useful.
Yeah, thank you. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. You go to college and you're graduating in the financial crisis. The oil prices were also not that good. And so walk me through the rest of it. How do we get to determining materials?
Yeah, so going to school, Boston area. This is the early 2010s. So there was really right after the financial crisis. There was a big clean tech boom and bust while I was in college. And back then, in the U.S., it was really just Silicon Valley and Boston were the main tech ecosystems, like L.A., Austin, Miami, and other places. They really like didn't, or New York even, they really weren't like big startup hubs. So I was kind of really in the heart of it. Like I knew one of the founders and kind of C-level executives at A123 Systems. I was just in the startup scene. I'd go to all the MIT and Harvard events, and I got to see the clean tech kind of ecosystem back then. But unfortunately, there was a big bust. And my learning at the time from an engineering perspective was like, look, all these new technologies of solar, wind, EVs, batteries, biofuels, biochemicals, like all that stuff was like really, at the time, it really wasn't very revolutionary. It wasn't very 0 to 1. It was a lot of iterative technologies, and it wasn't that much better than the status quo, right? So like I'm seeing how like, okay, the whole world is dependent on oil and gas, and like the price goes to the moon and it causes a global financial crisis. And then like, hey, we should be doing biofuels and all this other stuff. And then but then what I come to realize at the end of the 4 years, right? So you go in with just optimism as a freshman. You come out senior year as like, okay, you're mildly, I wouldn't say jaded, but like you're like, you now understand the realities of it, right?
Yeah.
And even when I was at school, I actually did some internships at Shell, right? So after graduation, I was at Shell. We can talk about that after. But
Yeah.
you come to realize like, okay, a lot of what they were doing wasn't really that much, like it wasn't going to beat the status quo, frankly, right? And what I also realized, is basically all these different technologies of EV, solar, wind, batteries, they were all heavily dependent on China, right? So they were kind of like brittle, like insecure supply chains. China was doing all the manufacturing, all the assembly and stuff. But really the bottleneck I noticed back then, this is over a decade ago, is that China completely dominated the metal refining of critical metals, meaning the rare earth elements, the copper, aluminum, gold, silver, platinum group elements. They had a complete lock on that. Like up to 90% of all the metal refining was happening there. So basically it's like, it doesn't matter where it's mined. It doesn't matter where it ended up in end use case, right? If it ended up in my Tesla EV, battery pack or some other company, a solar panel, right? Regardless, it all went to China. So if you were to map the global flows of all this stuff, it's like
All of them
it
are
starts,
converging.
it starts somewhere, it finally ends up somewhere, but it all goes in and out of China, right? So that's like a complete dominance of the global supply chain. So I realized that back then, and as I was doing more research, I was like, oh, it's not just the electrification. It's electronics, it's defense, it's space, it's automotive. These critical metals are really the foundation of modern industrial society. And again, it's China that has that critical metals dominance, right? So that's what I realized. I've spent over a decade, even before I started Determinant, before I started the company, like learning about critical metals refining, becoming the expert in that. And that's ultimately why I see myself as the best person in the world to tackle this issue.
So I definitely want to explore the lenses of the geopolitical side of this, but I still want to keep track on your journey as a founder. So you mentioned like you worked in Shell, and was that experience how the moment you realized that the oil refining logic could be applied to materials, or like when you say that you were like you spent all of this time collecting knowledge around this area to become the number one person in this field, how did you actually went about doing that, becoming the number one on this particular field?
I mean, in the beginning, it was really academic, right? So it's like
Yeah.
while you're still at school and like right after school, it's like you literally start Google searching. You'd find papers, patents, videos. You'd start reading those. You reach out to people. I started going to trade shows, talking to people, learning about it. I bought textbooks. I spoke to professors. Like I'm like reading like. We might get into this, but conventional technologies really haven't changed much at all in 100 years, right? So I'm reading 100 plus year old books, metal refining, extractive metallurgy books. So things like that. That's kind of how it gets going. And then, as I mentioned, like immediately after immediately after graduation, I went to go work for Royal Dutch Shell. There was a lot of formative experiences I worked directly. I mean, I did some other stuff before that, but the post-graduation, I worked in an oil refinery for a couple of years. And like that was kind of like a key insight. Like, what's it like working at this giant, billion-dollar monstrosity of a kind of a materials processing, system, right? And it's actually experience that like not that many people actually go through, like not many people have. So it was quite interesting, and like there were definitely a lot of learnings from it. Our technology, we figured out how to scale down the capital and the operating cost, the complexity of such a monstrous machine, and so that was a lot of the insights and learning. It's like, okay, like things are really complex and complicated and can be very dangerous actually in an oil refinery. How do you make a simpler, more efficient type of system, right? So it's like, the sort of like micro and modular nuclear reactor thing, the SMR is like kind of hit the zeitgeist at the moment. This is something similar. Like, how do you do that similar sort of like small localized type of processing in the metal refining space?
Yeah, beautiful. And so you worked there for a while. And I love how you just mentioned that from a technology standpoint, things haven't changed that much, or haven't changed that much back then. Can you like let me in on that? What do you mean by that?
So all the conventional technologies, whether it's China or even frankly startups in America or in other parts of the world, or existing tech, it's really just dependent on these old school processing techniques that are really built off of mining, right? So with mining, you're digging up the earth, you produce the mineral ores, and then you run certain types of processes to produce the metals, right? So that what they've done, people that are focused on that, they're using a lot of these old processes. And even if they focus on above ground sources of metals, like think manufacturing defects, industrial catalysts, used electronics, they're still copying the mining processes. So the mining processes, there's three big buckets that you basically, place the types of processes into, and often all three happen in one kind of facility. But it's pyro, hydro, and electrometallurgy. So what that means, it's it's got the roots of the word. Basically, pyro is anything that's like very heat based. So it's a smelting type of processes. Think like the old school Carnegie steel, big blast furnaces, smelting, steel mill type of thing. So extremely expensive, extremely polluting. There's a lot of emissions that come out of that. And just like a very old school, a very energy intensive, obviously, type of process. The other processes are hydrometallurgy. So what that means, it's you're using different liquid chemicals, right? So often, it's always some kind of acid or cyanide type of process where you're dissolving metals in, right? So It's very expensive. It's very dangerous. It's polluting. At the oil refinery, like my scariest, not scariest, but like kind of the chemical that I was always most wary of was like not the oil or the gasoline or anything, not anything
It's
explosive.
acids.
It was acids. It was HF, hydrofluoric acid. Like that stuff is very scary. It'll like eat into your bones. So, that's the kinds of processes, like acid-based type of processes. So it's also very, like I said, expensive. It's energy intensive because you often have to, you're heating the acid, you're boiling it often. The processing is really slow. It can take weeks or even months to do processing. We've come up with a completely different new type of process in order to do our extraction.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about the technology behind what you guys do. In fact, like, can you give me like the 60-second pitch that you would do, or a kind of elevator pitch that you would do around your business, and then we get into the micro refinery technology.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've kind of been doing part of it, but like basically, we've talked about kind of the background and that sort of thing. And like I said, because China has such a lock on critical metals refining, it's frankly the biggest issue that the United States faces and kind of like the sort of Western or outside China world faces. And it's frankly something we might go to war over, right? And so you're seeing in the current administration and kind of it's bipartisan. So current, Congress as well, there's been like just news item after news item for the last like 6 months or so of like the administration and Congress is realizing in the US like just how big a deal this is and how much we're beholden to China on that, right? And so the US really hasn't picked a national refining champion in this space. Like there isn't a clear metal refining leader. Like there's been a lot of support for there's a lot of like prominent nuclear companies or mining companies or magnets companies, but there isn't really anyone that's kind of like the last American refinery, right? That's sort of clear leader in metal refining. So that's why we aim to be that. And it's a multi-trillion-dollar market out there, and so we're tackling it, and we see ourselves becoming $100 billion plus company, right? I would tell the VCs like a multi-fund returner, right?
Yeah.
So we have the tech and we have the experience and the unique technologies to do that. So we're building that flywheel to become the national champion.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about the technology. I believe from the conversation that I have that even though there's a lot of awareness of the issue that you're talking about, there's a lot of people in day-to-day lives that I don't think are aware of how critical the situation is, just generally in the whole world, but especially for the US. But that's why we should definitely get into that. But before, like, walk me through the process of microparticle metal refining, as if I'm someone who has just basic understanding of that particular realm of science.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So like at a really basic level, what we realized is like instead of doing the conventional approaches, we can break down materials at a bigger macro scale particle size. So when you're doing the chemical types of processes that are used with smelting or acid leaching, you're breaking things down to the atom layer, right? So it's like chemistry class. We realized that with a lot of different feedstocks out there, like manufacturing defects, used electronics, catalytic converters, industrial catalysts, things like that, that actually the metals are already present there at a much bigger scale than the atom level. So we can break things at a bigger, that was kind of like the light bulb aha moment. We can break things at a bigger scale, which means we can do it faster. We can do it with less energy. It's more efficient, lower cost, all that kind of thing. It's more thermodynamically favorable. So we've built a microparticle metal refining process, our MMR process, in order to do that processing. So what that means is we'll take something like, like a circuit board that's in a data center, right? For like, AI kind of data center. We'll break it down, we'll crush it, we'll grind it and mill it to where it's a really fine powder. So we're creating these micron sized particles, micrometers. That's 10 to the negative 6. So it's 1 millionth of a meter, which actually it is very small, but it's actually a million times bigger than the size of the atom, right? So we're creating these really small, fine particles, and then we're able to separate them with different hydrodynamic separation processes. So basically what that means is like you can have fluid flow across the particles and you can separate them because the different elements act differently. They have different physical and chemical properties, right? So there's different densities, there's different sort of like drag coefficients. They settle differently. So they kind of act in different ways, and you can get copper to accumulate together, you can get gold to accumulate together, you can get plastic to accumulate together.
Yeah.
So we've developed that process, and we've built a facility, the first of its kind, Micro-Refinery 1, in the United States, that is running that process right now.
Yeah. It's awesome. So one of the things that you've told me is that there are more metals above ground in products and waste, etc., than actual economically mineral ones. And that was when you told me, like, the only reason why I didn't react more surprised was because I've done some research on you when we were meeting for the first time. But I would say that's very counterintuitive for most people. Walk me through why that's true and why that matters.
Yeah, so again, it's like a lot of this thought process. I mean, the oil industry, frankly, has probably influenced me a lot. So, I mean, there's always the talk about peak oil and whatever. And frankly, I'm not fully up to date on all of the geological surveys and such. But that was kind of basically proven sort of untrue. There is a lot of hydrocarbon out there, natural gas, coal, and then different types of oil deposits. But frankly, it really is a big issue when it comes to the minerals. So it's funny that we've looked at it from the energy perspective. We haven't looked at it from the metals perspective. The grade or the concentration of the different metals of the ores has fallen dramatically. I think I read something the other day that there actually hasn't been any gold discoveries of like a certain size in like the last 3 years, which is like the first time that's ever happened. In general, there haven't been huge discoveries of a lot of these critical metals in like decades. And basically the grade has been declining. What that means is like old ore concentrations were much higher percentage metal compared to like all the other waste materials that happens with mining in the past. Now they're far less concentrated. So you're basically seeing how like the mineral ore concentration's falling, and at the same time, actually, a lot of these above ground sources, the metal concentration is rising, right? So like silver usage is actually going up in solar panels and in like NVIDIA GPUs, things like that for AI data centers. So you always have that inflection point. So people are always asking like what's the catalyst, what's the reason now? Investor circles, finance circles always ask that. There's a lot of reasons besides the macro reasons, but on the I guess you could say on like the sort of the technology market reasons, it's the fact that like the mining, the mineral ores have degraded dramatically while the above ground sources have increased a lot. So we're at a point where basically, it's not our main goal, and like we can process mineral ores, but like we think long term, like we're going to end mining. Like it doesn't make sense to even do it. You have all this above ground sources of different metals that society has produced over decades.
What do you think is the biggest bottleneck to just a widely adoption of that technology right now?
Well, it's determinant materials scaling dramatically. So once we as we're scaling the company, as we get bigger and bigger, we see ourselves as best positioned to dominate that space. But I mean, if you want me to talk about kind of other things outside the company, I mean, again, it's like people are stuck in the old mindset. They're like, hey, look, this is what's worked. People ask me questions like, oh, do you use solvent extraction? Do you use membranes? Do you use other random things, right? So people put it in a bucket of like, this is what was done, this is what it means to do metals extraction. And they're kind of stuck in that sort of mindset. So everyone just kind of copies what the existing stuff is. What they'll do is they'll say, okay, look, we have a new designer solvent, a new designer chemical that we don't have to use sulfuric acid. We don't have to use aqua regia. We can use this new designer chemical, right? In the end, it's the same paradigm of like, how do I break things up, make this soup of atoms, and then try to connect all the atoms, collect them all one by one. So we just don't see that as like a really, innovative approach. And people are kind of like spinning their wheels on that. So, mass adoption will happen like because of us, because we're taking a first principles approach, like someone like Elon Musk, like a first principles approach to completely reshaping a new space, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. So let's talk a little bit about the geopoliticals of the situation. Like you've said this in like just a few minutes ago in the call that we've talked. You've mentioned this point a lot, where like the China's just domination over this particular subject can be used as almost like an economic weapon, and we could even go to war about this, as you're mentioning. walk me through why, because that's a very big claim. I think that a lot of people are now starting to understand that this is a very important issue, but for people that are listening to this for the first time and are failing to understand the scope of why this matters, how would you explain to them why is it that China has this weapon, and how can they actually use it against the US and the Western world?
I mean, the answer as to why they have it is because they chose to have it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like what's the reason as to like why have we lost it is, I could be glib and say we chose to lose it, which I think is kind of true, but we kind of didn't realize what we were doing. Like we didn't prioritize a lot of these things, right? We didn't prioritize sort of industrialization. We prioritized software and finance and things like that, right? So it's kind of like the world of the sort of like the ones and zeros versus the world of the like the physical reality, right?
Yeah, atoms and bits, right?
Yeah, atoms versus bits, electrons versus atoms. So there's I'm forgetting the exact name, but there was like two military generals in the the People's Liberation Army in China. I think it was it was either 1989 or 1991. They put out this like treatise of like, it was like strategic warfare, unconventional warfare. But basically, like they were sort of laying out. It's actually very much like Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which I haven't actually read completely, but I own a copy and I've read a little bit. It's like why sort of like especially like why go, and it's also it's that Greek thing, the Athens versus Sparta, the Thucydides trap, right? So it's like why go head up against like a stronger a stronger sort of enemy, right? It's not really the story of any sort of like revolution or like guerrilla group. Even in the United States, like history class, the Patriots, they didn't march on the battlefield against the British Army and like shoot them like front to one. It was a lot of guerrilla tactics, right? Because that's how you sort of win against being a weaker power against a stronger power, right? So China realized, look, we're not going to go head to head like post World War II style against the United States. Like they're the global hegemon, superpower empire. How do we sort of infiltrate them and kind of beat them at their own game in a different manner, right? So like that unconventional warfare was like, it's industrial policy, it's economic policies, it's all these sorts of things, right? So we kind of had this mindset in the United States where it's like, okay, we've got free trade, we've got this like global order, and we're all playing by the rules, and economic advantage from what Econ 101, Econ 102 teaches you. It's okay to sort of import everything and offshore all these different critical industries. And China was like, okay, well, look, in order to win a war, or just even to like, how do you sort of industrialize society and pull yourself up? You dominate these manufacturing, you dominate the critical metals, right? So they had a lot of foresight early on, realizing that these different metals and the refining and the value chains were really key technologies for both like economic reasons as well as military reasons. And so that's kind of what they did. They spent decades working on this, right? Like they adopted a lot of the Western technologies initially, and they got investment from Western corporates, Western investors, and they eventually built their own their own sort of in-house expertise and that kind of thing.
So let me let me ask you something different. Part of this, of course, is related with policies and investments in order to basically help you develop your company. Even though there's a lot of people that right now are considering this a big topic, would you say that there's still a lot of people who are slightly unaware of it? And if there are, what would you say, like, what's the most important message to say, like, a senator who never thought about metals refining right now? Like, if you were able to, like, have a conversation with them, what are the things that you're saying to them for them to be fully aware of the scope of this, and why is it that you guys are, like, just fundamentals for the U.S. to get back to this power position?
Yeah, so I haven't yet been in the room with too many senators as of late. We're working towards that. We are making some inroads in the with certain people in the administration. I think so. The crux of your question, let me ask again. So you're basically saying what is the kind of key insight?
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of times, like a lot of people, and this comes from a previous conversation that I had with Neil, where a lot of times people that are making these decisions on policies, etc. They need to take decisions on so many different topics. It's almost like impossible for you to hold information about all of these different topics, right? And so a
Yeah.
way of you to have like the positive politics model that he shares is like okay, you can talk with these people if you have like these extreme knowledge about something. You can talk to these people and allow them to understand fully like your field. So I'm just wondering, like, if you get a moment where you get to talk with these people to inform them of better decision making when it comes to policies that facilitate the goal that you guys are having. What are some of the things that you're telling? I guess that you touched on a bunch of them just by giving context on the company, but is there anything that you're aiming towards that would facilitate like senators coming up with policies that would help America to get to that power position once again?
Okay, I think I understand the question better. Yeah, so I mean, basically, a lot of, like I said, I've been sort of seeing this for a decade plus, kind of thinking about this stuff in resources, geopolitics, climate, the environment, whatever, and kind of like the world. It's funny because like like what's happening right now is what I envisioned would happen. Like obviously not the exact details of this, but the kind of order that we're entering right now is happening, right? So like I would kind of encourage a lot of the things that they are starting to do now, right? Like huge amounts of funding at the federal level, for different critical metals and critical technologies out there, right? So there's, I guess I should just name them all. So there's like the Office of Strategic Capital, there's the Department of Energy, LPO. They have a different name now, I think. There's the Export Import Bank. There's the Development Finance Corporation. And then, the government already had strategic metal stockpiles, but like now they've announced this Project Vault initiative, right? So they're basically working with both private industry as well as the government is getting involved in creating strategic metal stockpiles to both, create demand and sort of like have consistent demand for suppliers here in the US, but also to make sure that people that are sourcing from them, companies that are sourcing from them can get their supply that they need of these critical metals, right? And the administration is doing deals and has put price floors on the price of rare earths. And, I'm pretty sure they, like, the vice president the other day announced a price floor on silver. And basically what they've announced also is like, they're going to put price floors on everything because, what I was hinting at earlier essentially is like, China was like, look, we can beat them at their own game. We can kind of pretend that we're doing free trade and it's like a free market system. I draw the supply demand curves like an Econ 101, Econ 102, which I did take in college. It's like, oh, it all just balances out. It's the protective, it's the competitive advantage for each country. But they've kind of fooled us into thinking that, the Western world, right? Meanwhile, they've subsidized lots of things. They've put lots of tariffs in place. They've done all this kind of industrial policy. Basically, they've run industrial policy, right? Which is actually, if you think about the global order of history, I'm actually a big history buff too. It's really the way things have always been done. There's always been protectionism. There's always been kind of industrial policy. There's always been like a grand macro kind of type of strategy. There's always been, some aspects of protectionism, right? So, what I'm getting at is we need to like stop thinking we're in this like idealistic type of world of like everything is free trade when in reality it's never existed. It's sort of like a textbook kind of theory in some aspects. Like, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe it should exist, but like it's not the actual reality of the world. Like there are reasons that different countries do certain things. So I would say start thinking more like that. And the people are doing it. It's bipartisan. We're less in a world of the 2010s. We're more in a world of the 1930s, the 1940s. So go ahead.
Why do you think that happened? Like, what was it about like the West that, culturally speaking, just allowed us to just collectively jump into this idea of an ideal world and forget about the actual implications of of these decisions?
I think, there's a lot of reasons. It's kind of it's almost slightly a different subject, but I mean, basically it's easy to just like move money around. I'm from, I don't know if I should like crap all over the area, but I'm from Fairfield County, Connecticut, families from New York City. the whole area is, it's like the financial, New York is the financial epicenter of the world, right? So it's like, how do I sort of accumulate the capital and make sure all the money flows in and out of my system, right? So it's a lot easier for the US and the West as a a broader system to just basically, kind of collect rents, economic rents on the existing system, to manage things that are like, in the cloud, like in finance, in software. It's harder, and it's, historically at least, it's more polluting, to have big industrial societies, right? So it was easier to just offshore and, use cheap labor and let someone else's, someone years ago in the EPA told me, and she wasn't saying it like it was a positive thing, but she basically told me that the America's policy was to ship all the dirty stuff abroad. So both the waste that we produce as well as the industries that were historically more polluting, right? So that's the manufacturing, that's the extractive industries like mining, materials processing, all that kind of thing. So, it was kind of an easy decision to do that. Also, like, I mean, it gets in more of an esoteric subject, but like for the United States specifically, when you have the global world, global reserve currency, meaning that like the whole world needs dollars, everyone's dependent on our system. They all have to go through our system. To some extent, you basically have to have huge debts and deficits, and you have to be a massive net importer, right? So basically, it's like, people kept their money here, but it was easy for us to just kind of live as a society and live above our means, frankly, without producing very much. We became a consumption society in the United States as opposed to a production society. So we offshored all these different things because we didn't really have we were unchallenged, right? There wasn't, there wasn't that like, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, threat of World War II, but we have to reindustrialize, There's a good book, actually. I've actually never read it, but like I know enough about it. People mention this book, Freedom's Forge. I was just talking to someone at a big bank in the United States that's getting involved in these kinds of things, and they're like, "Oh, the CEO of that company is handing it out to everyone." But basically, it's like that sort of industrial policy. A lot had to be done in order to like build all this manufacturing capacity out, right? So like the US at the end of World War II, I'm going to get the numbers slightly off, but forgive me on that. But it's like we had like 80% of the world's gold. We had like gold reserves. We had like I think it was like 60% or something of the world's manufacturing capacity, like all the industrial capacity, all the factories. And it was like we had half the world's GDP, right? So it's like, we went from that to where we are today because like that took a lot of effort. I mean, like people made a ton of sacrifices back then, and people were working all the time. I mean, the men were out, fighting the wars, and the women were working in the factories. And, I'm not saying we have to go back to that kind of system or that we should go back to this system, but I'm saying it's tough to do that. And there needed to be a national will. There needed to be like a zeitgeist, a social cohesion, right? There's sort of this, I think I'm rambling now, so forgive me.
No.
There's
That's
this,
the whole point of a podcast.
Yeah. That's how these become 3 hours long, right? So, there's like this Islamic historian, Ibn Khaldun, right? So he has this concept of it's an Arabic word, asabiya. It's like social cohesion, right? And basically, and others have talked about this kind of over the years, but like there was a sort of like a social cohesion, a mission for the country. There was a united, against a common threat. And that's kind of why the country industrialized. And then, after, in the decades since, that sort of national mission and focus lost itself. So it was easier to just let it go abroad and kind of just have cheap imports and not care about what happened, right? Not care about living conditions in other countries, child labor, essentially slavery in many cases, all these nasty type of things that were happening and still are happening, in order to make our different products, which I'm not going to call it any one specific product right now.
Yeah, no, of course. So let me ask you something. Going back to, okay, we understand that there's this cultural shift happening where Americans are understanding like, okay, well, we actually need to go back to being like this massive power in industry. Culturally speaking, would you say that there's any kind of resistance from a standpoint of, once again, we're talking about stories, like it goes full circle to the beginning. Like I feel like a lot of the way that societies behave are directly driven through the kind of stories that we tell each other, right? I think that that social cohesion that you're mentioning is very tied to the kind of narratives that we have floating around in people or with people, and we have these players that share those kinds of narratives. Would you say that there's because a lot of times when we mention industry, we mention like these, like even being like a metal refinery, like all of these big, large visions, a lot of times we'll bring with it like almost these aesthetics of extreme industry, but also extreme pollution or anything like that. Do you feel like culturally speaking, you're at a moment where like generally people will be are excited about this bringing back industry, and also like for you specifically for the determining materials, how do you like how concerned or what are some of your thoughts on just increasing industry to a point in the relationship with pollution? So I guess I don't have a concrete question on this, but I'm just curious about what are your thoughts on this like dichotomy between just needing to increase industry, but also being aware of the whole climate and pollution aspect of it.
Yeah, related to your, I mean, it's basically related to your earlier question, right? So there's this sort of like this NIMBYism kind of thing, right? So like, besides being lazy, like I said, it's like you could just ship the waste stuff abroad. People don't want, NIMBY is not in my backyard. So people didn't want industry in their sort of in their neighborhood or even nearby and that kind of thing. So I was born in the early 90s, so I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s. That was definitely super present. I think I think it's been waning of late. I think it's like the last, again, it's bipartisan. I think it frankly probably started with the first Trump administration, and then it continued in the Biden administration. Then obviously it's continuing again with the second Trump administration. I think in those last couple, whatever that is now, like it's a decade basically. In the last decade, there's been more and more of like, okay, yeah, we get it. Like we understand there's trade-offs. There is no free lunch to any of this. Like, we need to do more and more of that here. And I think people, like myself, and there are others out there too, that are coming up with new technologies, cleaner ways of doing things. That's kind of, that's getting more and more interest from people, that people are realizing that, okay, like, there are trade-offs and it's not okay to just offshore everything. And that, historically, a lot of these things were dirty, but there are cleaner and cleaner ways to do it. We've reached a point where, we have new technologies out there. We can implement cleaner solutions for all this. So there is more and more interest. So the understanding grows with every year. When I first was pitching the company, like for my first time I raised venture capital, I felt like people didn't understand like any of this stuff. And like, it's amazing. There's still a lot of people that like kind of have misperceptions. I'll put it that way, misconceptions of stuff. But the sort of knowledge base is so much higher now, a few years later, than even just a few years ago. And like I said, like things are just accelerating in the US since like, I don't know, September, October, you could say. It's just more and more in the national ecosystem that, look, we need these critical metals, we need refining, we need to do here in the United States. It doesn't have to be dirty and polluting. We can do it efficiently.
Yeah, that's part of my question, where like you've been studying this for so long, and all of these different lenses, like the technical aspect of it, like the geopolitical lens of it. You've lived through this. You've worked in these companies. Like, how is it that how is it going from the world is only now, as you're saying, like last September, so not even a year in, the world only now is starting to pay attention to this whole realm. What is it to go from nobody understands what I'm saying to everyone thinks that they kind of get it, maybe even to a point where it's like they actually don't that much? How is it to go from all of this, and how are you navigating that as a founder?
Yeah, I mean, it's a different challenge. So like I said, like 2-3 years ago, it's like you had to educate them on the most basic thing and like why they should even care, right? It was only like the really forward-looking people that got it. And so like let's say my existing investor base and existing kind of suppliers, partners, customers, that kind of thing. Fast forward now, especially as of let's call it Q4 of last year, basically, you go in conversations with people, and it's a different challenge because they come in knowing about it, but they think they understand. Like they think they understand the space. So like they know there's this nebulous thing called critical metals, and they're like, okay, yeah, like we need to, tackle this, but like they're getting bombarded also like by a million different people. They're seeing a million different things. so they're not quite sure like what's the bottleneck and where's the value accrue, right? Or like what does it actually mean to be a unique technology, right? And again, it's like humans, we're pattern matching. We're trying to put things in boxes to make sense of a complicated world. So going back to the technology side, like they're trying to like they create boxes for themselves to like understand how this stuff works. So it's like, okay, are you a solvent extraction company? Are you, some kind of chemical leaching type of company? Are you doing, membrane separation, that kind of thing? So you kind of come in with having to, people, it's almost like a little knowledge is sometimes a challenge, a problem as well, right? So you have to like re-educate them on like what actually is the bottleneck and like why you can do something differently and like where's the actual economic value going to accrue. And like, in my case, like I said, again, it's refining is the bottleneck. We need new refining technologies. We can focus a lot on above ground sources of metals. We don't have to use conventional smelting or acid leaching technologies. So it's a different challenge. I'd say it's easier, than having to like get them to even care about this.
Yeah.
So now they care, but it's like now you have to kind of like undo some of their learnings and re-educate them on some things.
Okay. What's the one thing that founders building in the world of computers don't understand about building in the world of atoms?
Oh, okay. Well, there's something in the world of atoms called the J curve, right? So it's like, to some extent, it's kind of like true for all startups, but the timescales are different. So like for hard tech startups, defense tech, what I'm doing, it's like some years of like, okay, there isn't much external traction, let's put it. Like there's a lot happening below the surface. There's a lot of stuff that's getting developed, but like in terms of outside revenue or outside sort of like visible traction to the world, it looks flat, okay? And then eventually it takes off, right? Because you land that first giant customer, right? And the momentum kind of builds and takes off. With software, like it is also to some extent true on a different time scale, but for the most part, it's like it's a much easier ramp. It ramps a lot faster, right? So typical like software people, and I guess like I said, I'm kind of in fundraising brain, I guess. So it's like software investors is like they're looking at it from a software lens. It's like, okay, what is my what's my annual recurring revenue ARR on this, and like what's your gross margin and these kinds of things, like, and they kind of think of it as like. And then also like in the metal space, I think people like in software, although you're seeing that AI is really commoditizing everything, all of software, and it's destroying all these SaaS companies, right? Which is what the hot space was for the last God knows how long, decade or something. They tend to think that like software has the potential to be unique and kind of like high gross margins and kind of be the dominant player, whereas they tend to think that like in industrials, in metals, in manufactured goods industry, they tend to think it's more commodified, again because they're looking at the data of like battery prices collapsing in China, and solar panel prices collapsing in China, TVs collapsing in Korea and Japan and China, right? But like they're not seeing that like the world is different now. We're in a different ecosystem, and so the pendulum has swung too far to that side. It's now swinging back the other way, right? So it's like we will now have the market power, we will have the pricing power, we can build large, big, enduring, profitable businesses. And it's not just a race to the bottom on pricing, right? Like we do have a lower cost of production long term, but it's not just that we're trying to be the lowest cost producer only. Like the government and kind of forward thinking companies in the United States are specifically looking to lock in supply of these metals here in the US because they know they can secure it. I mean, that's what that Project Vault is about. It's like, at any point China could cut off, and they have done it in the past, have cut off critical metals. But look, we have a supply, sources in the U.S. that are fully traceable, secure, resilient. You know where it's coming from. You know you're going to get it, and people are willing to pay a premium for that, right? It's not that you just look up the price of gold or copper on the internet on CNBC or the front page of the Wall Street Journal and see what the pricing is. Like that's just an index. Like when you have long-term, strategic supply contracts, the price isn't just a commodity price. It's priced for it's priced for having that strategic supply in a short term and like having it having it here in the US. So
yeah, That's a great answer. Thank you. Nikhil, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're running out of it. Let me ask you one last question. Let's say that everything goes right for Determinant Materials. Right now, we're fundraising season. Let's say that you get a lot of money. We're hoping that that's the case. And like over the next 5 years, like things go the way that you were expecting them to go, which we know it's rare, but still, let's humor me. What does the world look like if that happens?
What's your horizon again? You said how many years?
5 years. 5 years.
Yeah, so I mean, we've got the first facility here, Micro Refinery One. Where our facility is actually in Florida. So it's in Florida in the United States. In 5 years, we're going to have multiple of these all over the country, and we'll be supplying the government. We're going to be for strategic, like the Department of War for these kind of mineral stockpiles we're talking about, as well as all these different critical industries from defense to space to automotive, electronics. So we within a 5-year horizon, we are going to become that national champion I talked about earlier, right? We're going to be the key supplier that everyone depends on, right? So it's like, okay, you can get and actually I didn't really touch on this earlier, but like it's all kind of, we basically see that like in the future there's going to be like the crappy, like you don't know where it comes from, did it have like support genocide and child labor, like Chinese, at any point the supply can get cut off. So you're basically having a bifurcated market eventually. It's like, and this also is the sort of like price floors that I was talking about earlier. It's like there's like the Chinese copper, there's the Chinese aluminum, there's the Chinese gold, and then there's the one here in the United States, right? So you're going to have that market, and we're going to be that dominant ecosystem player. People are going to look to us, Determinant Materials, for our metal, right? It's not that you go chase other suppliers. We're going to create that ecosystem where we are the dominant source for all these different critical metals.
Yeah. Nikhil, thank you so much for taking the time. One last question. If people want to reach out to you to ask you questions, know more about Determining Materials, what's the best way to do so? Where do they want you to like message you or email you or whatever? What's the best place to do it?
Oh, that's a good question. I probably should have thought of that ahead of time. I'm not gonna give my email because I'm so bad at going through all the emails. But I'll say I think probably the best is probably is my Twitter actually. So the handle is NRG91720. You can put it I think in the show notes, right?
Absolutely.
That's what the podcast say.
Yes.
That's probably the best way. My DMs are open. Happy to, and I'm pretty active on there, so they can kind of engage with me on there as well.
Yeah, and they can also see a phenomenal movie that you have both on determinantmaterials.com and in your Twitter account. Nikhil, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. To everyone else, please go and follow Nikhil on Twitter, on X. Check out Determining Materials. And if there's any investor that was listening to this conversation, make sure that you reach out to Nikhil as well. Nikhil, this is awesome. Thank you so much. Everyone else, bye-bye. I will see you in the next episode. And